Warning: this podcast may contain graphic and triggering content. Please listen at your own risk. Each individual struggle is different, and everyone's recovery and healing journey is different. Please reach out to a certified medical professional if you need help. Welcome to episode 55 of Stomp the Stigma, the podcast aimed to fight the stigma surrounding mental health through education, awareness, experiences, stories, resources, and the vulnerable truth. We are back for part 2 of my conversation with my very good friend Anthony. If you didn't hear part 1, go back and listen to episode 54. But today we get to dive into even more about his struggle with anxiety, kind of how mental health has a history in his family, and how he doesn't have an official diagnosis, but he found medication to help him nonetheless. Plus, this week we get into all of the coping mechanisms and everything that he's done to help himself through the hard days and through his struggles. I think Anthony brought up so many good points and so many tips and tricks that I think a lot of people will love. So I hope you guys like this episode, and I will be back with another interview in a couple weeks. Oh yeah, I feel like I don't know how to relax completely. Like, I always have to be doing something. I'm always busy. I'm always, like, my brain is all over the place all the time. Like, I'm thinking about different things, and if you ask anybody that knows me really well, they're like, no, she does not relax ever. She's always go, go, go.
Yeah.
And I think that has a lot to do with, like, my own anxiety and ADHD and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like the thing too is, like, I have a lot of cousins because I have big families on both sides, and the cousins that I have in Calgary, they're pretty much all ADHD. They probably have like 40 or 50 of them in Calgary, and they're all like that. So, like, and then my dad's sister, his oldest sister, Stella, is bipolar as well. So, like, it's all over the place in the family, and that's where when I talked to her, like, after the medication started working, she said, okay, now the question is going to be here, how much effort do you want to spend trying to figure out what your actual diagnosis is, or do you want to find medication that works and just, okay, we know it's something like anxiety, you get these problems and this problem, the deeper you want to go, the harder it's going to be, and there may not necessarily be any positives from it. If we get something that works for you, stick with it, and then if later on you want to try to, like, concretely nail down what exactly the issue is, we can, but you said it's not necessarily needed if it works, right?
Oh.
And that's kind of been, like, I think that's helped my anxiety a little bit, is just, okay, we have something that works. I know what to do now when, like, it does get up a little bit and I do have problems with it. I know how to manage it now, and that's another thing that I never learned how to do before, and it's kind of working at the feed mill has kind of helped that a little bit, because you, like, stress management, I never understood what that was. When you have coworkers that stress out about the stupidest shit, and then realizing, like, I'm not experiencing any emotion around that, in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't fucking matter. So it's clearly something that it's not needed. Like, it's not something that I need to be worried about because nobody else is worried about it. It's obviously not that big of a deal. And that's where you also have to rely a little bit on the people around you knowing what they're doing, because if they're not freaking out, it kind of gives you a sounding board. It's been kind of nice because I think there's like 15 or 16 of us at my job. So, and there's, let me see, there's 10 of us that do the actual production part of it. So it gives you, there's 10 people that you can kind of mentally use as a sounding board. If 9 out of 10 of them aren't worried about it, I probably shouldn't be either. So it allows me to, like, transfer my energy to something else that actually matters, right? And then, because it's a little bit rough when you by yourself because you don't have that sounding board. So, like, knowing when you can use one and how to use them properly without just being basically like everybody else, like that saying goes, it gives you a little bit of information and, like, know how to learn. If they're not worried about these things outside of work too, then okay, well, I have to work on like not being as worried about that because it doesn't matter as much as I think it probably does. And yeah, it's been a huge help learning essentially what my limits are, right? Because that's what a lot of that is that's limits of, okay, this is a limit of don't worry about it. This is a limit of worry about it. This is a limit of I need to be stressed out about it. Yeah, it's been, and the one thing that I've found too is once I like my anxiety started getting under control, I had a lot easier time dealing with my finances too. That's a big like potential disaster waiting to happen, like it was when I was younger, because that didn't do things so smartly with my finances. But just like once you start to calm down and learn, okay, some of this stuff, don't fight what you're naturally wanting to do, use it to your advantage. And like that's something that I learned in sports when I was younger, but I never really thought to apply it to other stuff. And then once I started like calming down and I was able to realize, okay, my natural tendency is to spend money. If I spend it all right away in that way of pay all my bills, payday, all my bills are paid, grocery shopping's done, my savings have been transferred, so I can't touch them. I don't have a potential issue waiting, big giant, basically thing waiting to explode my face, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's been nice just because that's while it is a major thing to worry about, it was a secondary thing to worry about at the time when I was trying to like get it under control, because that was bigger than the finances. Because if I'm not okay, then the finances don't matter, right? So learning. Okay, yeah, this is my biggest thing now. Okay, yeah, that's taken care of. My next biggest thing is this, and then my next biggest thing is this, and like I feel like I've gotten to the point where my next decision is, okay, do I want to live out here forever? And I've kind of just decided, like, because work hasn't been treating me very well, that it's not worth it to not be treated very well, even if you're making all right money at it. So I'd rather be living in Calgary with my siblings, where we don't talk about the religion side of things, because I made that very clear that because I stopped talking to my mom basically when I hit 18 until I was about 26 or 27. And the rule to us talking was that decisions that I make, you're not allowed to question them. If you question them, we're not talking anymore, because it's hard enough having to deal with myself with it, that I don't need to deal with 6 more versions of me trying to decide whether I made the right decision or not. Right? It's just too much stress, and like it's not that part that hasn't been an issue. Like even though it was growing up, and that's where picking your battles thing was important, because I've kind of arrived at the point where I feel like now I don't know like if this is something you normally bring up, but the whole idea of God and everything, I've kind of dismissed it. So like it makes for really awkward times sometimes when you're at home and your whole family's religious, and that's where I just don't talk about it. Nobody wins with that, because they're not like adults when they talk about that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It turns into a yelling match for no reason, and so like I just they go do their church thing on Sunday when I'm there, and then they come home and I'm at home, and like nobody really says anything, so we just kind of like leave it at that. Even though it's not the perfect scenario, I guess it works, kind of thing, and makes it so that we can still be in each other's lives without it being this huge big deal. It's just a fight all the time. And like I've never told them that I never actually directly told them I don't believe God's real anymore, but it's one of those things that if you bring it up, is anybody gonna like? There's no winners in that scenario, right? So it's not a battle that's worth fighting, because 6 of the 7 minds I have no say in how they feel about things. So I need to decide, is that a fight I need to pick, and I've decided that it's not. So I just kind of leave it alone, just so that way it's not any harder than it needs to be. Like I know, like my youngest brother, he went from being basically so I'm not sure how much you know about Christians and all that, but uh, there's a lot of different sects. But the one that my family belonged to, they still do Mass in Latin, and it's all basically their Council of Council of Nicaea, no Council of Trent. Oh yeah, Trent, because it's Tridentine, right? So yeah, which is basically the response that the church had when Martin Luther had his Reformation. That's literally where their whole like thought line is, just that it's in that frame, in that time period still. So like there's a lot of stuff that's just really old thinking that a lot of people have just decided that it's kind of trash, basically. But Thomas basically he became a Christian, and that to them is a huge step backwards because they consider it like a liberalized version of things, so they consider it as taboo too. So like it was a big deal because apparently my mom and my oldest brother stopped talking to him for like a week after he told them that he wasn't going to mass anymore. He was going to like the born again Christian church, and it did not sit well with them. But I just told him, I said, just do whatever makes you happy. You have no control over what other people think of you. As much as you think you do, you have no control over what somebody thinks of you. And that's something that when you accept that, it's kind of freeing because then you realize you only have to live your life for you, not anybody else. Like they're not the ones having to live it. They don't have to answer to your own head about stuff anymore. So there's just it's a lot of information that you have to sift through and try to decide. And that's where my brain being all over the place has somewhat helped because it helps me see, okay, scenario A has one of three or four different resolutions. One is all in all, one is nothing, and then two are in the middle somewhere. And that's kind of really been able to help me decide on a lot of things where I stand. Because I don't like the idea of the all, I don't like the idea of nothing, so I'm somewhere in the middle. And I started to realize that with a lot of different things, be it politics or just life in general about things, I'm very much in the middle with a lot of it. And I try to just assess things on their own individual merits as opposed to like a whole ideology overall kind of thing. So like more liberal people, or that's the big thing too that I still struggle with sometimes is my family being religious. They label everything as liberal, conservative, and like everything has a label for what people do. And I do still sometimes struggle with trying to mentally remove that label as being an actual thing because majority of people don't fit in perfectly into any of those. So like it just seems completely pointless to have it if they don't fit into these conformities that they've created. So rather than do that, you have to accept people on their individual understanding individually why they've arrived where they've arrived as far as what their thinking is. Yeah, like I'm sure you understand like all that the kinds of information that your brain goes through, and that's just inside of a day. Like it's just there's a lot going on, and sometimes you can get overwhelming. But that's where having some distractions can be helpful. Like having my pets is really handy sometimes because when you don't want to like think about it, you can just play with them and you kind of just forget about it, and you go sit down on the couch and it's like, what was even wrong? I have no idea, and that's okay.
So it sounds like there's a lot of mental health concerns in your family.
Yeah,
For you,
aren't addressed.
do you think that your mental health issues are like come from genetics or from kind of the environment that you grew up in and your family?
There is some genetics to it, just because obviously with my aunt also being bipolar, and then having a lot of cousins that have been diagnosed with ADHD, and some of that is, but also some of it is the situation being where a lot of those diagnoses don't happen until later in life because they don't accept them as being a real thing. You're just being a brat is basically what it is to them, right? And so like it's partially genetics, but it's exacerbated by not having a proper evaluation system of, okay, there's something wrong with them. There's very little to no control over this. We need to do something about it. So like it is genetics, but it's also could have been dealt with better because like these things they clearly happen because literally that's what's going on so much in the world right now. Like with just things between things like school shootings and the effects that a lot of the COVID lockdowns have had on people, where it's significantly affected their mental health because of their inability to hang out with people sometimes, and so like it's front and center so much right now, and it needs to be talked about more. It needs to be more like paid attention to, because at the end of the day, the thing that I learned is the only two things that matter are you happy and I forgot what the second one. No, just because so the reason that came up is my youngest sister just had a kid the other day, and my mom's not talking to her because she's not married yet and she had a kid. So they're not talking right now because of that. But when Rachel kind of talked to me and told me about this kind of happened with us, kind of similar to what happened with me, she's like, I hope you don't see me as any less of a person. It's like, you know what I've been through. You need to be you, and you have no control over what anybody else does. And the only thing that matters at the end of the day is, are you happy? If you're happy, everything else is secondary to that. Mm-hmm. Like, just because you're happy doesn't mean everything's perfect. It just means, okay, you're at a good place. I could do with some improvements, but I'm with people that care about me, and then that's a big thing. Is, are you happy? And at the end of the day, if you can honestly answer yes, and the thing about that too is, you answer that question to yourself. You don't need to answer that to anybody else. If somebody else questions, "Are you happy?" but they're more trying to poke holes in if you say you are or aren't. If they're trying to poke holes in it, that's not productive, and that's not something you need. And that's where those people can kind of just need to go away, because that's not. It's hard enough dealing with it on your own. You don't need another voice in your head, basically saying, "Oh, are you really happy though? You could have done this better. You could have done that better." Yes, but those are things that I did in the past, and I can't change them now. And I've learned that I need to do this, and the next time a scenario comes up like this, if I perform better in it and a significantly better outcome, I've clearly done the most that I can do with the bad situation that happened the first time, and I turned it good this time. So there's just it's a lot of stuff to think about, and it's also partially feels like it's a little bit of the product of the people that you're around too, just because they can either really help you or really hurt you. And that's where, when you're younger, you don't necessarily see that or understand how that works. But as you get older, you start to see who those people are and who they aren't. You have to let go of the ones that it's not a good relationship with. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because, again, at the end of the day, the question is, are you happy? If you can answer that to yourself and understand what it means, everything else is secondary to that. And it's just, over the last few years, is a lot of my siblings have talked to me about stuff, because they tell me that I feel like I'm really grounded, because I can go through, with my brain being so active all the time, I can go through all those scenarios in my head and be like, okay, this is a situation, you've got this number of scenarios that could end up happening. How do I basically make it the most ideal one without being completely ridiculous about stuff, or just going over the deep end, right? And that's where Thomas talked to me when that happened, where he decided to becoming Christian. He reached out to me, and we spent about 5 or 6 hours on a video call the one day talking about it. And you could just see by the time we were done the relief on his face that somebody does understand what he's going through. He understood a little bit of the depth of some of the stuff that I went through, because when I got home after boarding school, because I went to boarding school in Kansas, because there was a school there that taught all that stuff. I was home for about 3 months before I ended up moving out, and one of the things that really exacerbated that was my oldest sister. She had gone there when she was younger, but she only did 8th and 9th and 10th grade, I think, and then she came back and did 11th and 12th through homeschooling. But then things kind of broke down there, and she went and started dating this guy that we had known since we were younger. When we moved out onto an acreage outside of Rocky when I was about, it would have been 95, so it would have been 6. And they lived just up the road. And she went and started seeing him in, what was it, 12th grade, I think. And then she got pregnant with Brendan before she was married. And that is basically what caused that to blow up. And then when I got back from high school, I went over there one time, and basically Mom found out that I was there. I tried to tell Philip to tell her I was over at Adam Collier's, one of Philip's friends, but she called him, and of course I wasn't there. So that kind of ended up blowing up, and then I ended up moving in with them I was there for about 3 months. Then I got my own place, and then yeah, like that's where Rachel's talked to me a fair bit about stuff, because she's kind of gone through a little bit of the same thing with getting in the fight with mom about her decisions with stuff, and then not falling in line with their religion kind of thing, and being chastised for it. And she was kind of just looking to see like how I dealt with it, and I had to tell her, look, the way I dealt with it was not good. It did not go well for a long time, but at the end of the day, the only question that you have to ask is, are you happy, and are you making the world a less shittier place than when you got here? And if you can answer both yes to both of those questions, you can figure the rest of it out. Like, that's kind of just, you have to find your grounding, basically your grounding rod a little bit, and those are basically the questions that I've asked and I've had to answer sometimes, especially like asking that when you're not doing so hot, or you've done something that you don't entirely like yourself for doing. Because that's another one, is when that happens, that your head has got to be the worst place to be, because it just keeps going over and over again, and it's not a good time.
So was there kind of like a low point or a turning point for you when you realized that your anxiety was like taking over, or that you needed help, or like needed to change something for you?
I realized something wasn't quite right. Basically, from the time I was about 16 until I was about 25, but not knowing how to evaluate it,
Mm-hmm.
it made it impossible to try to figure out what was wrong. And like, I wouldn't say there was one event or one situation that caused it. It was just an accumulation of going through those extreme highs and extreme lows, especially when like you would go drinking. That one was rough. And being, teenage guys in Regina, we basically went drinking every weekend when I was living there. So it was like that extreme up and down. You kind of realize, okay, you need to do something to like even this out, because you're not able to make anything work. And then it gets to the point where, okay, I moved out here, I wasn't in it as much, but the ups and downs were still there. So the issue obviously wasn't alcohol. So then I was, okay, it's something else. I spent probably about a year trying to figure out what it was, and I couldn't figure it out on my own. And that's when I went and asked my doctor. And like, so it wasn't one particular event; it was more of just a series of them. And that's where I said I could, I kind of got a little lucky that I didn't need to hit that rock bottom that a lot of people do. Like, there was no, I didn't have to worry about self harming. Hasn't really been an issue for me. Obviously, there is a level of depression there with the lows, but it never became like an overpowering issue for me. So that kind of was also a good thing and a bad thing, because that kind of also left me off of seeking help sooner, because that wasn't there. And I thought, okay, well, if something was really wrong, this should be more severe, and it's not. So that kind of held me back a little bit for asking for professional help. And then the other thing that I had to kind of think of too is, okay, am I just doing this for attention? Because that was a huge problem from the time I was like 15, 16 until I was 25. Is so much of the stuff that I was doing was because I felt like it wasn't getting attention, and that I needed it, and any attention was good attention, and it's not. I started to notice that. You probably noticed it too over the last few years, that it's I stopped doing things that generate attention, and it's more just about, like, I'll talk to you about just other stuff that is more, just about everyday life. Like, it's a lot less of like the really heavy shit, or of the really like complicated stuff. But yeah, like, I feel like not having a more severe version of depression where it results in self harm may have held me back a little bit, just because I know so many people suffer with it. I don't want to like clog up the system by just being another person in there that's just looking for attention, right? Like, I didn't want to be that person. So it did hold me back a bit, but it was also it was a little bit impulsive asking about that, because actually my doctor's appointment was when I cut my hand, and she was looking at it, and then she left, and then when she came back, I'm like, would I be able to talk to you alone about something? And that's when I talked to her about it, and that's when she's like, oh yeah, this is what it is. We can do a combination of medication and therapy. We can do a combination of, we can do just therapy, or we can do just medication. Um, she said, what I suggest starting with from the description is we'll start with just medication. We can add therapy in if you feel you need it, or we can take the medication away entirely if it's not helping. And just like having her being so enthusiastic about wanting to get the best possible outcome for me was made all the difference in the world of me being able to follow through with it, because that's another issue. I'm sure you know, is trying to follow through on stuff that's scary. It's really hard to do. It was, yeah, it was a combination of like just being lucky with the people that I was around was what a lot of that was.
You said that you have never officially been diagnosed either.
No.
Does that bother you at all, not knowing, or that it hasn't been, like, I guess, confirmed for you?
Not really, because what I've been doing has been working so well for so long. I have this impression, and I'm not sure if it's right, but trying to get a definitive diagnosis mentally can be fairly intrusive.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a little bit intimidated by that.
Yeah.
Because, okay, having an official diagnosis, is that going to change much of anything for me? Because I figured out things that have worked, and I've learned how to like try to take advantage of just the way that I naturally am with things, and just instead of fighting it, just try to like use it to my advantage. So I feel like an official diagnosis it doesn't seem like it would be any positive effect,
Mm-hmm.
if you know what I mean. Like it might give me a label for it, but does that really help me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no. And then the one thing that was I kind of noticed that. Sorry, I just blanked.
Okay.
I was gonna say something about that psych course that I took, but I forgot. The professor for that, she tried to convince me to become a psych major. I decided against it because I realized I wasn't able to process emotions properly, because that's another thing that you have to learn how to do. And turns out that's a bitch.
Mm-hmm.
Not just processing, but acknowledging that you have them, and even if it's about something that doesn't matter. Like I was always under the impression that emotions were things like, oh, when you get married, or when you have a kid, or when you go through like a major life breakthrough or something. That those are the times you have emotions, but you always have emotions, and that's little bit of, it's a lot of information.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Your anxiety and everything, is that something that you think that you are going to live with for the rest of your life? Or do you think that's
Yeah.
something that you'll eventually kind of heal from?
I think it'll end up being something that I deal with most of my life without knowing the future. Obviously, it's kind of one of those things. I'm just taking it one day at a time right now, but I have thought about it. But that's where my doctor, like right now, like he's sending me just for like some blood tests, just because taking these anti-anxieties for extended periods of time, they have side effects. So he's testing me to make sure that these aren't happening, and if they do, we might have to try to switch to something else. Or because one of the things that my doctor recommended initially was working out, but I have issues with like not having somebody to motivate me to always be going, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I did work out for about a year, but it was kind of sporadic, and so it wasn't consistent enough to feel like it was helping me. So that is kind of why I decided to go with the medication route instead of like the uh, working out, just because it's hard to get motivated to do that, especially when it's just you and there's nothing like pushing you a little bit to go do it. I kind of tend to not end up doing it, so that's where knowing that part about myself was kind of important too. It's hard to say. I think it probably will be, just because even now, like when something stressful at work happens, it surfaces, so it's obviously not gone. It's something that I've had 3 anxiety attacks in the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's how little it's happened, and so like it's still there, obviously. So I feel like it's probably going to be something. I may grow out of it. I know your brain chemistry does change every 8 to 10 years, that's always in the back of my mind is it is possible that I'm going to be okay. And that's where I do have to talk to my doctor and ask him, okay, if the symptoms are going away, how am I going to know? Is the medication going to change how it's behaving with me, or is something else going to happen, or will I not know unless I try to go off of it? So like I still have to ask about that. But I was going to ask about that because I have my appointment's not for another couple weeks yet, but when I want to do that blood test stuff, and then he's going to have the results for it and stuff and go over it. I'm going to ask him about that because that, like you said, it's been kind of a little bit in the back of my head. Is it's going to be something I'm going to have forever? Am I going to get better with it, or what? But so I'll talk to him about it, and I'll see, and just kind of go from there. Because it's again, this one of those things that it's an interesting idea to think about, but it does give me anxiety thinking about it a little bit. So I've kind of like it's a fleeting thought.
Yeah.
It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, but that's where again, kind of knowing and understanding how it affects you is good, because then you know what questions to ask and which ones to kind of stay away from a little bit, because yeah, it's not always a good time when you ask some of the hard questions, and you don't want to set yourself back because it takes a lot of effort to get here.
So you found medication that works for you, which is
Yeah.
amazing. So does your anxiety affect your day-to-day life anymore?
99% no.
That's
And that's
awesome.
because I've learned one of the big things was you got to pick your fights. So if there's, you have to evaluate. Okay, if I pick this fight, is there going to be a winner? Like, as dumb as that sounds, is anybody going to win from this? Because if nobody's going to win from this, it's not worth my effort. And that's where I think some of it is a certain amount of maturity about understanding what it is and when to not necessarily give into it, but when to explore the idea a little bit. And yeah, because like that's a question sometimes too. Is my doctor be like, okay, how's your anxiety levels, how are your stress levels, and then trying to differentiate what I'm feeling from what normal stress levels are is really hard to tell the difference. But that's where I try to use a little bit like my anxiety attacks as like, okay, that's too much. That part's too much. Or like, if I don't feel something about a scenario that I probably should, I know that, okay, yeah, that's not entirely right. So maybe I need to like think about this a little bit and try to figure out why I'm not feeling anything when I should be. And that's where kind of work is a little bit helpful, because I regularly have to assess it, as opposed to like it being more sporadic in your personal life, where like stressful situations can sometimes be a little bit further in between, as opposed to a job where like the stress is not constant, but it's a lot more rapid fire. So it does give me a little bit of a chance to really test things out. So, okay, if I feel that I've got this under control, if I feel that this is out of control, and this uh, specific scenario like triggered it, the next time I go through that, if the outcome's the same, okay, well, I got to figure out what am I going to do about it. Is this a work issue? Is it my anxiety? And that's where knowing how I react in these situations all the time, you have to kind of store the information a little bit in your head, so that way you can assess, okay, let's say it's happened 100 times and 95 times out of 100 I've been okay with it. Okay, well, I'm probably doing okay with it then. But if it's 50-50, okay, maybe I need to go find a different route here, or uh, figure out better stress management for it. And that's where my coworkers have been huge, because like I'll go over to a place like Colton's place I just finished doing his floors. Like we did a little bit of they knocked a wall down and they flipped their closets around, and I did the work there, and like they were really chill to deal with, and it was actually quite fun. Like I really thoroughly enjoyed it. Having that there really helps reset yourself. And then too, like the other nice thing is like we play games on like online video games. It allows us to hang out doing that too. So it's like, okay, even with COVID, we might not be able to hang out as much, but we can still visit with each other like that, and it's a really good stress reliever, and it just really helps me feel better sometimes. So it's been really good that way. Then like Christian, I go golfing with him sometimes. Like in the summer, last summer, I went golfing with him 5 or 6 times, and that was a lot of fun. He doesn't really hang out with people outside of work, so the fact that I could get him to come out with me, everybody at work was really happy about that, because we were like, we need to try to get Christian to hang out with us outside of work, because we know he likes us, because we talk and bullshit and have fun together and stuff and laugh. And so obviously but we think he's a little bit shy, because he's been one of those people that pretty much just hangs out with his family kind of thing, and I don't think he's used to so much hanging out with other people a whole lot. So just getting him to come out with me has been good. So we're trying to get him to come over to Colton's sometime, but he'll be like, I don't know, I don't know if that's a good idea. And so understanding owners will back off a little bit, and then next time we ask him, yeah, that seems like a good idea, we could try that. So just kind of understanding that I was there at a point mentally too.
Yeah.
Knowing kind of having somebody not necessarily to push it, but to understand where you're coming from, and make you realize that people do like to hang out with you, and that you're worth hanging out with.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big thing. So I'm trying to help him navigate that a little bit, because you can tell he seems like he wants to hang out. He hasn't said it directly. Well, he has said it directly, but it's you can tell he's just kind of seems shy about it. So just kind of taking it a little bit slow, but it's been nice, because we went golfing and he has lots of fun with that. I had fun with that, and that's where having, like I said, friends that do all sorts of different things all the time makes you realize that it's not even one particular thing that you like doing. It's just who you do it with. And yeah, so it's been nice, because it allows you to kind of transfer some of your energy sometimes if you're kind of feeling a little bit down. It lets you focus some of your energy on what you feel is helping somebody else with something that I don't know if he necessarily knows he might be struggling with it or not. But yeah, I don't know if that makes sense or not. But
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like socializing and human interaction is huge for your mental health.
yeah.
What other kind of coping mechanisms do you use when you're going through those hard days?
So far, being at work, there's only been 2 bad days where socializing hasn't been able to help, and both of those were within the last year, and I didn't deal with it very well. So I don't necessarily know that I have a quite as effective as a coping mechanism as I hoped I had. Just based on the fact that I have had a couple bad days where the socializing didn't help. They both happened on a Friday, and I basically just went home, and I was kind of felt like shit all weekend. But that's where I have to maybe look at some other options, as far as if socializing doesn't do it, where kind of look to try to cope with it, because there's been situations where it hasn't worked in. I have to try to find some other things, I think. And the one thing that can't kind of help is if it's in the summer, which unfortunately it wasn't both times. But I have to I'm working on my house, right, and that's a huge stress reliever. So if it happens in the summer, I'll go home and I kind of have energy, because my brain's kind of going 100 miles an hour. I can go work on. I'm sanding down my exterior right now because it's wood siding. It gives me somewhere to put my energy and kind of transfer it. But I do need to find a better way to do it in the winter, because that's when
Mm-hmm.
it's a more stressful time for us, because that's our higher production time. So I do need to try to find something that, like I said, works a little better, because there have been times where the socializing doesn't work, and just the smaller things that I do sometimes, because sometimes when it's a little bit of a shitty day but not really bad, I get home and both my cats greet me at the door, and that just makes me super happy, because they're happy to see me, because they both come out as soon as I open the door, they both come running and they want to get pet. I do have a bunch of little things, but yeah, I do need a way to deal with it better. At the really bad days, because yeah, those it hasn't worked as well. It hasn't worked, because I'm one of the people, when I'm really feeling bad, I don't want to socialize.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of isolate myself. So I am looking into finding stuff that works better, and I'm open to suggestions if you have any, because yeah, it's not a good time.
Do you journal at all?
No.
Because I find, for me at least, that helps me a lot. Well, my coping mechanisms, I cook a lot, obviously.
Yeah.
Um,
That actually is a big help for me, actually.
yeah.
Now that you mentioned that, like I like cooking food, and I recently for Christmas I got a bunch of Amazon gift cards and I got an air fryer. Oh, it's the best thing ever. I love it. And like I figured out how to get like hard rub crusts on meat.
Yum.
Oh, I know it's good because like I've been buying like pork loins, like whole pork loins. And I just cut them up,
Mm-hmm.
and then I cook those in the air fryer, and like they have a hardened crust, and it's so good. Like I don't even need a knife to cut it. It's just the fork just sinks right through it, and it's like, oh, this is so good.
Yeah, that sounds so good.
Yeah, yeah. And then like to use my slow cooker a lot too.
Yeah.
Because that one's really easy. And then like I've barely used my oven since I got my air fryer. Like I think I've turned it on twice. Yeah, and then I also like to barbecue a lot too in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's pretty much how I cook in the summers with the barbecue, because you don't have to generate heat because it gets really hot here in the summer.
Yeah.
And it's humid. It'll hit like we get regular days where it's 35, 36 degrees, and then the humidity is like 90%, and it's just rough. So like having to turn the oven on it's not good. Considering my windows don't open either, so I don't really have ventilation. Yeah, that's why one of the reasons why I'm renovating it is because they're those old single pane windows.
Yeah.
So they don't open. Yeah, like I'll use cooking a little bit, and then sometimes working on my house, and then one thing that I actually find kind of helps too a little bit is if somebody's having a problem with something, troubleshooting, and you figure it out. I find that's like really rewarding, so that can kind of help too. So like somebody's having a problem with their vehicle, or somebody's having a problem with, like, my buddy has problems with his computer sometimes, and I've been able to fix it every time. So like it's satisfying. Somebody comes to you with a problem and is like, oh yeah, do this, and then it's, yeah, fix it, and that fixes it, and it's like kind of makes you feel good because then you feel, for lack of a better word, useful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I get that. Yep.
But the weird part is, so like I've been like, one thing that Colton's kind of steered me towards is reading a lot about some of the phrases that we have in society that don't make that are kind of like dark if you think about it. Like one that really I never really thought about until he pointed it out to me. He said, "You ever think about why they call it earning a living? Because it makes it sound like the default position is that you don't deserve to live."
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of just was like, oh, that, like, I never really thought about that. And like it's there's a thread on Reddit called anti-work. It's not what it sounds like. It's not people just wanting to freeload or anything like that. It's about how certain things should be happening because people obviously can't afford a lot of things. People are going untreated medically because they don't have money, and that's not how it should be. That's not what should be dictating that. And it's kind of a lot what that thread's about, and you kind of realize a lot of these are some of the limitations that we have as society right now that need to be addressed, kind of thing. And just kind of realizing how much certain things have some control over your life, but then at the same time, I don't go too deep into it because there's obviously the rabbit hole of it. Kind of turns into conspiracy theories pretty quick, but it's kind of a nice distraction sometimes. It just makes you think about other stuff that you wouldn't normally think about, and kind of just refocus your energy on something that's not, oh, I'm not doing this good enough, or I'm not doing that good enough. This kind of just refocuses your energy on something that's like, oh, that's something to think about now. Like this is interesting. Like it's a really good point. Like this country does it, and it's worked out really well for reason A, B, and C. Oh, okay, well that's interesting. And then yeah, it gives you something to focus on other than just yourself, which can be a little bit exhausting sometimes because just the amount of stuff that goes through your head, it can get a little bit overwhelming sometimes.
Mm-hmm. So your anxiety attacks are very far and few between now, which is fantastic. But do you know kind of what your triggers are now?
The only one that I've been able to identify is basically really high stress. Like
Okay.
they're not specific, and that's where, like, when I was talking to my doctor, I remembered that from that psych course that I took is they differentiate between panic and anxiety. Um, Panic is specific triggered. Anxiety is general trigger.
Mm-hmm.
Something as simple as stress is considered a general because it's not one specific thing like a spider or heights or anything like that. But that's another thing. So since I started taking my medications, I'm not scared of heights anymore. I'm not scared of like being up on scaffolds on the sides of buildings or anything. Like stuff that normally would make me uneasy when I was doing construction doesn't bother me anymore.
Oh, wow. That's
So,
really interesting.
yeah, yeah. So like it made me wonder. Okay, it wasn't necessarily the specific thing that was doing it. It was just my anxiety in general, and then it was heightened by that. So like the fact that it's gone, that's why the specific triggers. That's why I have been calling them anxiety attacks, not panic attacks, is because
Mhm.
they're not they've not been specific stimulus. So like heights or being in like unfamiliar situations. The two scenarios were both high danger, unfamiliar situations. So like one of them was a fire in the hammer mill, and the other one was a bin entry, and my foot started to sink into the grain, and that scared the shit out of me because, well, if you get sucked into grain, you can't get pulled out. They have to empty the bin, and so kind of all those thoughts go through your head and just makes it hard to breathe. They were both very high danger and unfamiliar situations for me, so that's kind of where uh, I've learned that arises from, and that can be helpful. In that, once I think about the situation, okay, this is unfamiliar and this is high stress. I'm having an anxiety attack. Okay, I need to focus on what do I know, how do I deal with this. Like, just focus on like I've been trained for most of it, so try to focus on what you know and how do I remove the danger, how do I get myself into a better situation, and then that kind of distracted me mentally during the like that fire in the hammer mill. It distracted me enough that the anxiety had completely dissipated by the time I went back to basically gone back that after I was done doing what I could do to prevent it from being a mill fire. So like it distracting it enough until my general anxiety came down enough that I could manage it and deal with it once I had mitigated the situation to a point where okay, now that I think about it, it's not going to overwhelm me, and I'll be okay trying to decide, how do I manage this, right?
Mhm.
And that was one thing that like the doctor, he was pretty impressed by, saying, yeah, just falling back on your training is, and then diverting the attention away until the stressful situation was gone, then dealing with it, because it's a lot easier to deal with when that situation isn't time sensitive anymore, and then you can kind of gives you time to fully process things as opposed to only the things that immediately come to your head. Because with the amount of information that I try to deal with, my anxiety goes into overdrive. It makes it really hard to pick out the right ideas. But when that time scenario goes away, when you think about it, you kind of end up eventually finding, at least I do, eventually finding a path that kind of helps me kind of reduce my anxiety, kind of not come to terms with it, but more just like level it out, if that makes any sense.
Mhm. Okay. I have two more questions that I
Yeah,
ask most guests that come on the podcast. So the first one is kind of looking back over your whole journey. Is there any advice that you would give your younger self, or is there any advice that you wish that you would have received when you were kind of at the beginning of all of this?
it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah.
Like, for sure. Like, there's nothing wrong with not being okay. It doesn't mean you're weak. There's nothing wrong with needing help. Because at some point in everybody's life, they need it. And you're being selfish by not getting that help. And you're only hurting yourself. So
Mhm.
once you kind of arrive at that arrival kind of felt like its own catharsis in its own way. Because then once you get there, you can kind of accept the fact that, okay, I got to figure out what to do, but I'm halfway there already. However this journey takes me, it feels like it's going to be okay because I've gone to the right people that can help me. I can learn from my own ways of doing things how to reduce it as much as possible, how to manage it when you can't reduce it, how to, just make everyday life livable. And then the biggest change being that I'm living in the now. And as much as people say that, until you've gone from living in the future and the past to just living in the now, it doesn't entirely make sense what that means. And then once you arrive there, you're like, this is exactly what I've been looking for so long. It being natural, not having to force myself to try to do it anymore, where it allows me to just be in the moment. And the other thing too is that doing that now, being able to feel emotion is the other thing, because that felt almost like it not went away, but because it's no one near as intense, it feels like you're not feeling the emotion anymore. But that's not the case, because you're still, it's just not overwhelming anymore. But that's kind of one thing that takes a little bit of getting used to, is it's not as, doesn't need to be like soul crushing intense every time something happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just little things can be, you can experience emotion just from a little thing. Just somebody texting you and saying hi that you haven't talked to in a while, like that making you happy, and it not being like an overwhelming sensation that you kind of have to like distance yourself from a little bit until you can process it. It's such a relief.
Mm-hmm. Okay, my last question for you.
Okay.
Is there a stigma or a misconception surrounding mental health that bothers you the most, or one that you hear most often that isn't true?
So like with my dad, with the whole religious background thing, the one that bothered me the most was people that weren't in this situation saying nothing was wrong, because they didn't experience it. When the bipolar is so bad that when his episodes get so strong he can't even talk.
Mm-hmm.
Don't tell me nothing's wrong. Like, you weren't fucking there. Like, no, like that is not true. Like, it's ridiculous when somebody like when the mental health issue gets so bad that person loses the one thing that separates us from a lot of other animals, is our ability to communicate. Not all animals, obviously, but like for a lot of them, and you lose that ability, it's that powerful. Don't tell me nothing's wrong. Like, you're not there, you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the one that really bothered me for the longest time. Like, at first it didn't, because, well, I didn't entirely understand it. But then as I got older, it's just kind of like, you weren't there, you didn't experience the day to day of it, you wouldn't understand. So just shut your mouth. Like, you have no idea what's going on here. Stop talking like you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big one for me too. Well, that is kind of all the questions that I had for you. Was there anything else that you wanted to share that we didn't really touch on?
Not really. I was a little scatterbrained, and I apologize.
No,
But
you were
I don't.
fine.
I didn't feel like I was missing a whole lot. Like, there's a lot of stuff I talked about that never really expressed out loud before, so it was kind of nice to be able to like walk somebody through it, especially when like you've been through it a little bit, so you know
Yeah.
kind of the mental journey you go through for every little thing. And it's all just the little things, and it's like, it's exhausting.
It is sometimes. And I know you were nervous to come on, and I hope that it was okay for you, cuz
Oh yeah, I feel pretty good right now. Like, I don't feel nervous, I don't feel anxious, I don't feel bad at all. I feel pretty good right now, actually.
oh, good. Well, I want to thank you again for
Yeah,
sharing everything with me and coming on and being open to sharing with everybody else too,
yeah,
cuz I know that's very nerve-wracking.
yeah. It's fairly like intimate information, but at the end of the day, if I can say one thing that maybe helps somebody else, it's worth it, right? Like,
Yeah.
it,
Absolutely, yeah.
like I said, some of the people being in my life at the right time, I got lucky with that, and that's where I understand how powerful it can be to have the right person say the right thing at the right time,
Mhm.
and that can just change everything.
Yeah, that's like you were saying yesterday, just even a little text message
Yeah,
is
yeah,
it can make the biggest difference.
yeah, and like, and that's where, and it doesn't take a lot of effort either sometimes, and that's where it can be nice, and like, that's when you know people really understand being human.
Mhm.
Like, that's just when it takes so little effort to do something that simple. There's no reason not to do it, even if you don't do it as much as you want to, because you get busy, and we're adults and we have busy lives. But just doing it every once in a while, just the very little effort it takes and the difference that it can make, it's
Yeah.
worth it.
Yeah. Okay, if there's anyone listening that wants to reach out to you or has more questions for you, are
Yeah.
you open to that?
Yep.
And what is the best way for people to contact you?
Uh, Probably through email.
Okay.
I can send you my email in text or something, and then you can add. I don't know how you add that.
I'll just put it in the description of the podcast. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'll add it to the bottom there, and then I'll send it to you. Sorry.
Okay.
And then you can add it to the bottom.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Feel free to reach out at any time. You can contact me on Instagram and Facebook at Stomp the Stigma YYC, and you can email me at stompthestigmayyc@gmail.com. If you like the podcast, please like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Apple Podcasts. And if you or someone you know would like to come on, I would love to have you. Share your story, speak your truth, and together we can stomp the stigma.